Dealing with customers, I usually called Dad the owner, or the main smog technician if we needed to sound legit, but as a kid, I had always considered him just another Cambodian mechanic, a stereotype, one who'd pinched enough pennies to open his own car repair shop. The summer after college, I felt like a real dumbass for having thought so little of Dad, but in my defense, that was what Cambo men did. They fixed cars, sold donuts, or got on welfare. At least according to Dr. Heng's wife, who always, whether her car needed repairs or not, nosed her way into the waiting room of the shop. Back in our refugee days, when Cambos had just come to California, only her husband had stayed in school long enough to do something legitimate with his life, like become a doctor. She spoke about her husband's virtues a ton at the shop, especially after I'd graduated, failed to get a job with my symbolic systems degree, a concentration meant for coders not smart enough for the hardcore stuff, and moved back to the Central Valley from the Midwest. Her hair done up into a misshapen lump, makeup a shade too light, Dr. Heng's wife would materialize out of nowhere, swinging the sleeves of yet another floral silk blouse, then plop herself in front of the air conditioner and say things like, "My husband, Dr. Heng, he never looks up a thing when he diagnoses a patient. He is so much smarter than other men. He remembers everything." One day, when I just started working at the shop again, Dr. Heng's wife went on a tirade about how lazy guys were in my generation. "What is wrong with you boys?" she was saying. "Not one Cambodian man since my husband, Dr. Heng, has become a doctor here in America, not even those born with citizenship. My generation came here with nothing. We escaped the communists. So what are boys like you doing?" I was busy handling a customer who was getting impatient about his car. "Let me consult the main smog technician," I said to him, trying my best to communicate through my expression that Dr. Heng's wife was harmless, despite her tone, and despite her aggressive hair. After the customer went outside to take a phone call, Dr. Heng's wife approached the counter, and then whacked me on the head with a rolled-up magazine. "Why did you not become a doctor?" She tried whacking me again, but I stepped out of her reach. "Ming, please stop," I said. "Violence will not solve our problems, and neither will the model minority myth." "Useless big words," she scoffed. "That is all you learned going to college." I laughed. It was hard to argue with her. No one knew why Dr. Heng's wife came around so much, not even Mom, and her gossipy friends, but her daily visits had been happening since Dad first opened the shop. They happened when I was 12 and Brian and I took turns depositing checks at the bank across the street, which dumbass tried robbing so often it was later replaced by a church's chicken. They happened when I was 17 and studying for the SATs, while customers muttered passive-aggressive things to Dad for raising his prices. And they happened when I started hanging around the shop again, not because Dad paid me. Why would I get paid when Dad was already supporting me, but simply because I had nothing better to do. Brian thought that Dr. Heng's wife, in her younger days, must have fallen in love with Dad, only to lose all hope after he had proposed to Mom within an instant of their meeting. Following this logic, stopping by the shop was simply Dr. Heng's wife rubbing it in our faces that her life had turned out amazing, so much better than she had ever imagined when dreaming about Dad with her Lexus and Omega watches and Louis Vuitton bags smelling of fresh leather, all of them so giant I swore they had gained consciousness and could swallow me whole, were I to transgress their master. Who knows? Maybe Brian was right. Though Dad couldn't have cared less. He barely acknowledged Dr. Heng's wife half the time, nor anyone else who wasn't a customer. Most of his day he spent fixing the mistakes his guys made: a transmission misdiagnosed, an alignment over-rotated, a customer's car interior smudged with oil because one of the guys had forgotten to lay on the seat a clean protector sheet. Dad was a real softy for his fellow Cambo men. He had hired as many friends as he could, way more than the shop could actually afford, and let them get away with anything. It was a beautiful enterprise, no matter how flawed, the way Dad sustained so many people, a whole ecosystem, both in terms of providing a service to the neighborhood and also providing 12 Cambo men with jobs. He even paid some of them under the table so they could qualify for welfare, but only the guys with kids. Dad's epic tolerance for his guys was actually how we got in trouble in the first place. I mean, how we got in trouble when I worked at the shop full-time, as an adult of sorts. By no means was this the first time the shop had been in deep shit. Anyway, at the end of July, Young left the keys in the ignition of a customer's truck after test driving its repairs. He'd parked the truck in the strip mall beside to the shop, where we left the cars that were all done, right in front of the tiny hair salon that also functioned as a massage parlor and full-service mani-pedi spa, not to forget that it was the only decent joint to buy coconut rice wrapped in banana leaves. By the next morning the truck had disappeared. Technically, Young worked as the assistant manager, though he never really did that much assistant managing. "Oh, sorry boss," Young said. "I do not know what happened." He shrugged, and Dad was shocked into a stupid awe as he tried processing his assistant manager's feat of nonchalance. "What do you mean you do not know what happened?" cried Dr. Heng's wife, who was present, of course, to witness their exchange. "You lost a car." "Not a piece of car. An entire car." All right, it is going to be okay," Dad said, reassuring everyone in the waiting room, except himself, because he looked a tad bit nauseated, too pale to register as okay. "Toby, go look for the car," he said to me then. "Please, just do it." It was a near impossible task, contingent on the idea, I imagined, that some drunken homeless man had stumbled into the truck and taken it for a joyride around the block. Which, in fact, had happened once, years before. The homeless man was named Ace, and he returned the car himself, walking right up to the counter, and handing Dad the keys like the shop was a rental company. A younger version of myself would have resisted Dad's request. How many good-natured aces did he think existed in the world? But I couldn't hold it against him for wanting to try, for hanging on to a shred of hope that everything might turn out fine, that the worst parts of his life were over, so nothing happening now could be that bad. "Okay, I'll go," I said, and he forced a smile, tried his best to seem optimistic. Dad was one of those guys who smiled and laughed constantly, but never without a sad look in his eyes. I'd realized this about him shortly after graduating. One of Dad's other guys, Luo, a smog technician who didn't do much smog checking, had cracked a joke about always finding himself in oppressive regimes, first under Pol Pot, then under his wife, and now Young had driven their whole neighborhood mad practicing the electric keyboard during block parties, which made Dad laugh and laugh, and when he stopped laughing, and his eyes caught mine, I saw it, that look of faint, enduring grief. Realizations I should have had as a kid were, I guess, what kept me mopping the floors of the shop. Really, I needed to apply for jobs in the Bay Area, jobs with equity and benefits, not just free lunches with Dad and his fake best friend, Sathui, who owned a rival car repair shop on the other side of the Costco. I knew I was supposed to find a legitimate job, but at this point in my life, dumb epiphanies about home seemed so precious, urgent, fleeting. "I will come too," Dr. Heng's wife said to Dad, clutching her Louis Vuitton bag as if prepared for battle. "I need to talk to this guy over here, anyway," she added, gesturing toward me. Dr. Heng's wife and I climbed into my Honda Accord, which was 20 years old, but would never die, no matter how much it wanted to, as Dad kept fixing our cars to run forever. There was a comfort to driving this car, which had been passed from Mom to Brian, and then back to Mom and finally to me, but it did have subpar air conditioning. "My hot flashes are bad, Dr. Heng's wife said, fanning herself with my expired registration sheet. "When you marry a girl, make sure her mother is not having a bad menopause. It is genetic, you know. Everything is genetic. Everything gets handed down." "I'm gay," I told her, turning onto Swain Road, one of the residential streets by the shop. I drove as slowly as possible so we could check the cars parked on the street. "We're looking for a 2005 Toyota Tundra truck," I added. "It's like a muddy gold." "Yes, I know," she responded, though she for sure hadn't known. She was now fanning herself with a Louis Vuitton wallet that matched her Louis Vuitton bag. "You can still marry a girl," she said, and I half expected her to start speculating about the genetics of gayness in my bloodline. "I am well aware of that," I said, "the fact that I am allowed, legally, to marry a woman." Then Dr. Heng's wife pinched my cheek and jumped into a monologue. Stupid. Listen to me. I am being serious, like I am always being. I do not joke, and do not assume anything I say is a joking matter. I only have the best and smartest intentions for you and everyone your age. Why are boys so dense? Gay boys should be less dense than other boys, no? So how come you are not? Marry a girl because that is what you should do. I am not saying you cannot be gay. How hard is it to be normal and gay? This is the plan. You will marry a girl from Cambodia, a nice girl, a girl from a good family. And after 5 years, when the girl succeeds the citizenship test, you can divorce her and get joint custody of the children. Then you will invest your $50,000 in the stock market. Your life will be established. You can be as gay as you want after your life is established. That is the plan. Her monologue waned as we merged onto a busier street, as Dr. Heng's wife now listed the companies CNBC had marked as optimal investments. We passed 6 fast food chains and 3 parking lots. Then at El Dorado Street, Dr. Heng's wife yelled at me to pull into the lot of Angkor Pharmacy. I parked, and as Dr. Heng's wife was leaping out of my car and charging into the building, I considered her plan for my life. The whole premise was hilarious to me. It transformed my future into a slapstick comedy, similar to The Wedding Banquet, but this time starring off-brand Asians with dark skin. Looking around the strip mall, I saw the Dollar Tree where I would buy my school supplies and the record store where I would shoplift from because the sheet music for my piano lessons had been, like the lessons themselves, stupid expensive. There was also the cheap sushi restaurant with amazing fatty tuna and terrible imitation crab, a combination that never made sense to me, where I had told my high school girlfriend and prom date that I was gay. And finally, at the edge of the lot, there was the Cambo grocery store that Mom still visited sometimes, but only when she was pissed off at the owners of the better Cambo store. A group of dark Asian kids in baggy clothes, reminding me of my childhood friends, were rushing toward the Cambo store with dollars in their hands, though I probably imagined the cash part, their limbs awkward, lanky, spastic, and as I watched them move with such speedy motion, I remembered being younger, and how I so desperately wanted to rush away from the valley where my parents had been dumped, gripping whatever promise I had in my fists. Real possibility, I had convinced myself, existed in the big cities on TV, metropolitan areas where real life unfolded, where I could be as gay as I needed to be. Wishing my car's air conditioning wasn't faulty, I wiped the sweat off my forehead, before thinking, I can't believe I am sitting in this beat-up Honda, a college graduate, and entertaining the prospect of marrying a Cambodian princess for money. Even so, it was such a heartfelt idea, to think an arrangement like that, the stuff of farce, could actually bridge worlds. Inside Angkor Pharmacy, Dr. Heng's wife was leaning against the counter, engaged in a conversation with the owner, who was just then rummaging through a pile of papers and nodding his head at such a steady rate he definitely wasn't listening at all. When she got back in the car, I asked, "Did you get your prescription?" But she only looked at me confused, like my question was so dumb she could hardly process it. "Prescription? What are you talking about?" She responded. "I came to propose a new business plan for Angkor Pharmacy. They need to start selling more than just medicine. Look at how well Walgreens is doing." And when I started laughing at that, she shot me an angry glance and said, "What did I tell you? Do not laugh at me. I am not a funny woman." But I couldn't help it. Hands gripping the steering wheel, I just couldn't stop laughing. "So there are other dense boys you give advice?" I said, choking on my corny joke as I exited the parking lot. "You are not my only concern," she said. We drove through a few more neighborhoods after that, searching for the lost truck, listening to a CD of old Khmer songs, the same CD that had been stuck in the stereo since the Honda had belonged to Mom. I barely understood the lyrics, aside from a few phrases in the choruses, but I knew the melodies, the voices, the weird mix of mournful, psychedelic tones. When I tried articulating my feelings about home, my mind inevitably returned to these songs, the way the incomprehensible intertwined with what made me feel so comfortable. I'd lived with misunderstanding for so long, I'd stopped even viewing it as bad. It was just there, embedded in everything I loved. Back at the shop, the owner of the lost truck was screaming at Dad, about suing us, about rallying the neighborhood to take its business elsewhere. Dad responded by explaining that the police were currently investigating the truck's location, that he'd sent his own son to search for it, that he would take responsibility for the financial burden of buying a new car. Young and I listened from the garage. Standing there, I could already imagine Dad leaving the waiting room, masking his panic with blankness, only for Young to shrug off his blundering self for an encore of that astounding nonchalance and say, "Sorry, boss, I do not know what happened." Business went into a slump after that. The truck was never found. Some regulars stopped being regulars. When he came over for family dinners, Brian started conversations about Dad selling the shop, ridding himself of all that business overhead, and investing instead in rental properties, which he'd wanted Dad to do for a while. At the time, Brian was a real estate agent and sold houses on the side of town with fancy gated communities, so he knew about this stuff. "Look, this is all I'm saying," Brian said one night. "The housing market's as down as it'll ever go, so now's the time to buy. Prices are gonna jolt back up, like very soon, and I don't want us to be kicking ourselves stupid. I'm telling you, the loans will pay themselves off in no time." Dad sighed, as though his oldest son had yet to learn the single, most important lesson he'd been trying to teach for years. Why do you think the housing crisis was hitting everyone in the first place? You need live carefully. You cannot be trusting banks just like that. Property is the only stable investment. Brian cried, his mouth full of ginger pork. When the government blows up and society erupts into chaos, the only thing left will be land, and I for one. "Dude," I said, "swallow your food before yelling apocalyptic nonsense at Ba." "I'm not yelling." Brian yelled, punching me in the arm. "I'm just saying I'm the one trying to be careful here. Ba can't fix cars for the rest of his life." Brian and Dad continued to argue, with Brian launching into a crackpot theory that a newfound innovation was on the verge of making cars obsolete, Dad repeating to Brian to mind his own business, and so on. Occasionally, I stepped in as their referee, calling Brian out for getting too heated, as he often did, or interrupting Dad to say Brian had actually made a decent point, despite sounding like he believed the singularity was bound to destroy us. Mom, who'd spent the entire dinner scrolling through her iPad, tuned this conversation out, interjecting only to scold Brian for moving into his own apartment and wasting money on rent, to which Brian responded, "Mom, no girl's gonna date a 26-year-old guy still living at home." Mom rolled her eyes at Brian. "Is it so wrong to want both my sons under my roof?" she said, before returning to her iPad because she hated talking about the shop. As far as she was concerned, she'd exhausted enough of her life force begging Dad to fire those of his guys Young, in particular she deemed useless. Throughout my childhood, she would balance the shop's books late into the night, her neck craning over greasy, smudgy invoices, with those steady hands running through her hair, as if money might tumble from her scalp. By my high school years, after tolerating Dad's joking, for the 1,000th time, that his guys had wives and kids and gambling addictions to support, Mom had renounced her mission of boosting the shop's profit margin and began working overtime shifts at the Social Security office. Now, instead of balancing the books, she binged trashy and corny Gong Siams dubbed into Khmer on YouTube. She stopped talking about money and started daydreaming about retirement and traveling to Thailand to learn how to cook authentic Thai dishes, as she had already mastered every Khmer recipe, even the ones of meals she didn't like. "Thai food is just bad Khmer food," she once said, "but it's better than other kinds of food." What am I gonna do? Learn to cook pasta? Her future plans never referenced Dad, though sometimes she talked about a time when she'd live among Brian, me, and the grandkid she expected. "I want 2 kids from you and 4 kids from Brian," she'd say, and I never understood why she wanted fewer kids from me than my older brother. The fact is, I didn't want any number of kids, really. I was content with myself as a gay man, and I knew gay men could have kids, of course, but it didn't seem worth jumping through all the hoops, the surrogates, or the adoption, all the paperwork. The only time I took the idea of kids seriously was when I thought about everyone who had died, 2 million points of connection reincarnated into the abyss, how young Cambos like me should repopulate the world with more Cambos, especially those with fancy college degrees, whose kids could be legacy admits. Soon it was only other Cambos coming to the shop. That was how you knew business was bad, if white or black or Hispanic people, or even mainstream East Asians weren't walking through the doors. Our hometown had a lot of Cambos, sure, but not enough for a robust customer base. No one needed to fix their cars that often. Plus, these Cambos were usually relatives of relatives, or friends of friends, so Dad gave them so many discounts, we barely turned a profit. Dad's guys started playing card games in the back of the garage, where posters of naked Thai women competed for their attention with a Chinese zodiac calendar. Without a continual flow of customers in the waiting room, I organized old invoices and scraped crusted oil off every surface. I even tried learning how to balance the books, but Dad got frustrated trying to explain all the expenses. The waiting room was the cleanest it had been since the shop opened. It made me sad to think that the better the shop looked, the worse it was doing. This seemed, in some cosmic way, unfair. When there was no more crusted oil to scrape, I skimmed through job postings on my phone, refreshing the alumni career website over and over again. Dr. Heng's wife lectured me about going back to school and studying pre-pharmacy. I didn't apply for any jobs, feeling burned from all the career fairs and interviews I'd bombed in college. Still, it seemed productive to scroll through my hypothetical futures data analyst, technical writer, user interface engineer. Though, the harder I thought about it, the less I could imagine taking any of these jobs. Dressing up in slacks and button-downs. Making small talk with coworkers about the weather and their favorite hiking trails. Eventually, the days grew shorter, summer crawling into fall, and some nights, after working at the shop, I hooked up with one of Brian's old friends. We had run into each other at Costco. Mobile 5W30 oil was on sale, but you could buy only 3 boxes at a time. There was some local law that limited the amount of a flammable substance that a customer could have at once. So Dad sent me to Costco every few hours to stock up, and there I was in the checkout line, hoping the cashier wouldn't recognize me from earlier that morning, when Paul strolled over from the food court, projecting that casual angst peculiar to guys who never left our hometown, who stayed committed to a dusty California free of ambition or beaches. He asked me how I was doing, so I roped him into buying 3 boxes of oil for me. When I thanked him, he said, with a low-key smirk, that he was sure I'd make it up to him. After that, we fell back into old patterns of driving onto the secluded parts of the Delta's levee. It was the safest place to have car sex, especially if blowjobs struck you as boring. Paul was half Mexican, half Italian, and his girlfriend was Filipina. He worked as the manager of an AT&T store. Made good money, actually, if you included his commissions. He was handsome, in an unassuming way, with a constant stubble that made me go crazy when dragged across my back or stomach. His nose was huge but well proportioned. Sometimes I closed my eyes and used his nose to apply pressure to my closed eye sockets. It was weird but satisfying, like my eyeballs were getting massaged. If Paul wasn't into it, he never said anything to stop me. During one of my winter breaks in college, I'd messaged him on Grindr, after recognizing his Mars Volta t-shirt and the headless torso serving as his profile pic, and we'd hooked up here and there in the years leading up to my graduation, always in his red Sienna minivan, which used to be the minivan his older sister had driven to drop off Paul, Brian, and me at our K-8 school. That car had been infamous in our teenage mythology. High schoolers had called it the party van, because during lunch periods, Paul's older sister drove as many friends as possible to eat at the Costco food court. Then, when Paul started high school and inherited the van, he assumed the role of shuttling fellow teenagers to cheap food. 10 years later, you could still find Paul at Costco, in the middle of the week, eating $1.50 hot dogs. One night, after Paul finished in me, we were in the back seat of his minivan, my back still glued to his torso with sweat, lube, and cum. We stayed like this for a while, Paul burrowing his chin into my shoulder, as I watched the windows fog up from the heat of our bodies. Then, out of nowhere, he asked me if it was all right to bring his car to the shop. He needed an oil change. Not unless he convinced the Mexican, white, and Filipino drivers of the city, I joked, to also bring their cars to the shop. Thing is, I'm too white for the Mexicans and too Mexican for the whites, Paul said, running his fingers through my hair. And I guess I can't get you the Filipinos either, cause, you know, I'm cheating around on my girlfriend with you. Stop being a doofus, I said, you don't have to ask. Just wanted to make sure, you know, he replied. In case it'd be awkward. It's not awkward, I said, remembering a time when I was younger, sitting in the same back seat of this same red minivan, and feeling awkward around Paul, his older sister driving 50 when the speed limit was 25. He was only 3 years older than me, which felt like nothing now that we were both in our 20s. Still, I felt giddy to be having sex with the cooler older guy from my youth, who listened to bands like the Mars Volta. If only my closeted, sex-deprived self from high school could see me now, I sometimes thought, before realizing, yet again, how dumb it was to think that way about Paul, a closeted gay guy too scared to break up with his first girlfriend. Plus, the Mars Volta actually sucks. Why are you working at your dad's place, anyway? Paul asked. Why not? I answered. I don't have a job. Might as well. It just doesn't seem like you're seen. And what would that be? It was just a question. Forget it. No, it's not like I'm sensitive about this, I assured him. I'm genuinely curious. Man, I don't know, he started, you already left for college, so why come back? I thought you'd be living away somewhere with some dope job by now, dating guys who are good guys, you know. Guys who have hella dope jobs, too. Like bankers and doctors and whatnot. I'd never date a banker, I said, bracing myself for Paul to get mopey. This happened sometimes when we got together. He'd get in his own head about cheating on his girlfriend, Meryl, who actually was a nice person. She was a devout Catholic who said, oh my gosh. She asked about my day, with a sincere intention of listening to my response, whenever I ran into her. Obviously, I avoided her like the plague. Paul was in love with Meryl, or thought he was, but liked fucking guys too much, and when this overwhelmed him, he said cringe-worthy things like I'm not good enough for you. This night he was saying, I don't get why you're living at home, I guess. Right, I said. What time is it? We should probably get to bed. Nah, I'm serious, he said. You'd definitely kill it in San Francisco, you know that. Me, I'm gonna be here forever. I can't give up driving places. Parking in the city is fucked. I didn't know what to say. Truth be told, I could have lived like this forever, 2 days at the shop being lulled by the sounds of rusty machinery, dead bolts being bolted and unbolted, Dad and his guys making fun of American diets for being less effective than the Khmer Rouge diet of boiled grass. All I needed was the occasional hookup, a way to get off that didn't involve my own hands. Did you know I went to the gayest college? I asked. Sounds pretty chill, he said, holding me tighter, as if this were the last time we would fuck, though I knew perfectly well it wasn't. It was just a ton of gay guys in the middle of nowhere, Ohio, I said, moving away from him so I could collect my clothes. A bunch of theater majors and aspiring musicians and artists. I actually lost my virginity to a triple major in theater, music, and art, though I think he's in a coding boot camp now. Anyway, I had so much bad sex those first 2 years, my dick and ass were, like, constantly sore. I couldn't even sit through lectures right. I had to lean onto a single butt cheek at a time. Paul laughed. Why are you telling me this? It was fun, I continued. I'm not saying it wasn't. But, you know, when I think back to college, that's all it really was, you know? I'm not getting you, he said. I feel happy that's all just being here. I maneuvered back into my pants, leaned over, and kissed him, then gathered the cum on his stomach and slathered his face with my sticky hand. God damn it, he said, wiping the cum away, and we both started laughing. Later, as Paul drove me home, I watched the other cars in the street. Headlights streaked through the night in flashes of yellow and white. It was too dark to see clearly, but still I looked for the lost truck. I wanted so badly for one of the passing blurs to be that golden Toyota Tundra. A few days rolled by without us having car sex, and then Paul brought his red minivan into the shop. Brian accompanied him. They walked in through the glass door, Brian leading the way in his best suit, the navy one he wore to close major sales. It accentuated his amiable confidence, the air of being fully able to force you into a headlock and somehow make it seem good-natured, like you were the one asking to be restrained in the first place. Brian had never moved away, because he excelled in this city. It was reassuring to know that something about home allowed guys like my brother to thrive. "I'm here to block Ba from giving this dumbass a discount," Brian said, as he leaned toward us, across the counter, pointing at Paul discreetly with his thumb as if he ever spoke a single word that softly. "But seriously, Paul has a job. He can pay for his own oil change." Paul pulled out his wallet. "Hit me with the full charge, Mr. Che." "Don't worry about it," Dad said. "Just by making sure these guys are never killing each other, you are doing me a favor." He patted my head with a paternal amusement, a joking condescension, the grease from broken cars getting into my hair. "That's not the reason he likes you," I said to Paul. "He still talks about your ability to eat durian." "Christ," Brian said, pushing off the counter to pace around the room while stretching his arms, as if limbering himself up to jump on new opportunities. "Can we not talk about durian right now? You're making me nauseous." "You guys are so not Cambodian," Dad said as he waved his hand. "You are not even Cambodian American. Durian is real, true Khmer food." "Hey," I said, "I like durian. I don't even think it smells bad. It just reminds me of gasoline, which, if you haven't noticed, I've spent half my life marinating in the smell of." "Which one's durian?" Paul asked. Brian stopped stretching, grabbed Paul's shoulders, and playfully shook him. He yelled, "It's just the only food that Andrew Zimmern has refused to eat on Bizarre Foods. Think about that for a second. The badass dude eats fried grasshoppers, and even he thinks durian is gross. You know the fruit is protected by a giant spiky shell, right? They're so crazy and lethal they fall from trees and strike elephants on the head and, like, kill 'em. How is that not a sign we shouldn't mess with that shit?" "Oh yeah," Paul said, squinting. "I think I do like durian." Dad threw a pen at Brian and snorted. "My kids are spoiled," he said. "Anything you can eat, you should be eating. You think every meal we had during Khmer Rouge was smelling right?" I laughed, enjoying this banter, the kind I'd missed every day of college. "Bah, you gotta stop using the genocide to win arguments," I said, but before he could reply, or even chuckle, Dr. Heng's wife was bursting into the waiting room. "Bung, I checked with the monks," she said, after she had nearly crashed into Paul. "I know what you need to do." Dad raised his eyebrows and sighed. Skeptical defeat was his go-to response for just about anything this familiar woman happened to be saying. Oblivious to his expression, Dr. Heng's wife dug into her Louis Vuitton purse, which appeared bigger than ever that day, and pulled out a golden statue of Buddha, slamming its base on the counter with a loud thud. "We need to boost your karma," she continued, and rotated the Buddha, so that his cocky smirk was facing me and Dad. "This is the key to your success." Then she slipped into a breakneck Khmer that made me dizzy to try to understand, though I gathered she was explaining the details of some grandiose agenda. Dad only nodded in silence. After a while of this, Brian signaled for me to meet him outside. I attached an empty invoice to a clipboard, handed it to Paul, along with a pen, and left to join my brother on the sidewalk. Brian was peering into the waiting room. "How's Ba today?" he asked, his eyes serious and arms crossed. I don't know," I answered while also looking through the glass door. Dr. Heng's wife was placing the Buddha around the room, testing different locations, I assumed, for the best usage of its spiritual effect. "He seems fine to me." "Are you not paying attention at all?" Brian now asked. "His business is failing and everyone knows. It's a slump," I shrugged. The shop got, like, one bad Yelp review cause of the stolen car. We've been through worse. Dumbfuck, Brian said, shaking his head. Just look at the guy. So I did, but he seemed totally normal, tired but amused. Guess I should check in with him, I said, wondering if I'd gotten used to seeing Dad as defeated, if I could no longer tell the difference. Brian's face settled into a slight irritation. Yeah, do that, he said. Stop being a dumbfuck. I motioned to confirm that I would, indeed, stop being a dumbfuck, and then found myself staring at Paul, who glanced up from the clipboard and locked eyes with me. He smiled and risked a wink. It was corny, so damn corny, and again I felt like a kid gushing over his older crush, but this time I felt exposed, with Brian, Dad, and Dr. Heng's wife, of all people, standing that close. The next couple of weeks, Cambos rolled in and out of the shop. Some brought their cars for actual repairs, but everyone brought statues of Buddha, of all sizes and colors, to decorate the waiting room, even one that was painted an alarming hot pink. Dr. Heng's wife orchestrated the whole affair, having informed the community of the shop's urgent need for better karma. Mas and Gongs, Mings and Pos, all the older Cambos I'd ever met in my life, tried helping Dad the best they knew how. We put Buddhas anywhere it made sense. A crowd of medium Buddhas on top of the mini fridge, an army of tiny Buddhas lining the edge of the desk, a giant Buddha hanging out with the bamboo plant in the corner, with a few Buddhas stuffed between the desk and the wall, just to ensure we had our bases covered. When people ran out of actual Buddhas, they started coming with insignias scribbled onto scraps of paper. We taped dozens of them over the walls, alongside the smog check certificates and the framed photo of my youth baseball team, which the shop had sponsored. I stopped a half-blind Gong from taping an insignia in the center of the computer screen. We settled on the lower right corner. Every time a Cambo waltzed into the waiting room with another Buddhist emblem, Dad looked more disgruntled, more disappointed to hear the door swing open, the sound of a potential new customer, only to realize it was just another guy who'd picked rice with him for 12 hours a day, in the concentration camps. Each point of good karma the shop accrued seemed pilfered straight from his soul. All the same, Dad always entertained these Cambos. They had only good intentions, and Dad asked them about their kids, their siblings, their relatives back in Cambodia. Witnessing the shop bloat with spiritualism, you had to appreciate the middling optimism keeping our community afloat, those teachings all but promising that our lives, and our reincarnated lives thereafter, would remain, at best, tolerable. I stopped scrolling through job postings, as I spent most of the day trying to cheer Dad up. Even non-Cambodian customers, I told him, might find these superstitions amusing. As they waited for their cars to be fixed, they could play visual counting games, like the kind found in magazines for toddlers. How many ink blotches and fat Buddhas can you spot here at March Lane Break in Tune? I asked, and Dad laughed until he didn't. For lunches, Dad started packing recycled containers from Baskin-Robbins with leftover plain rice. He clutched invoices so close to his face, I sometimes thought he might suffocate. I couldn't remember if Dad had always been this stressed, if he had always held invoices that way. When I was a kid, he would avoid doctors, never wanting to spring for the copays, let alone an optometrist for something as basic as his ability to see. Yet even that hardly explained his behavior. During the shop's karmic makeover, Paul and I hooked up almost every night. Our sex became rougher, quicker, as if we had recently met off Grindr. I forgot lube a couple of times, and Paul never carried any around because what if Meryl found it? So we just used spit. The pain and the chafing and the hemorrhoids weren't great, but my need for relief only grew as the days marched into winter, as I got more and more worried about the shop. Way to make a guy feel special, Paul joked one night, after I came only 5 minutes into our hookup, and pushed him out of my sore asshole. Sorry, I replied. Yeah, let me give you a hand. A few moments later, I was putting on my clothes, my head and arms stuck in my t-shirt, when Paul said, wait a minute, Meryl's doing church shit, so I'm free all night. Also, I have something to tell you. He helped me escape my shirt and pulled me down. I collapsed into his embrace, landing on his torso so hard it hurt, or maybe my hemorrhoids had made me sensitive all over. I think I'm finally ready to come out, he said, and then, unsure of how to respond, I shuffled my body to look at his face. His expression was genuine, calm, wearing a gentle smirk like the Buddha's protecting the shop. I think it's unfair to Meryl, he added, if I don't, come out. No shit, I blurted, but he remained unfazed and kept grinning. What prompted this? I guess I finally worked up the courage, he said. You were my motivation, to be honest. You're so comfortable and chill, even here, in front of your dad and everything. He squeezed my chest, and I asked myself, does he expect me to be his new Meryl? Then I thought, maybe that would be nice. I imagined our lives together, our buying a house close to my parents, shopping at a Cambo grocery store every week. We would be an openly gay couple in the community, a radical symbol of love for the youth, for anyone who ever thought they had to quit their home, their family, their lives, just to be themselves. Why did you never move away? I asked. Like, seriously, I'm not special. I just had the opportunity to leave. He made a face, as though this were the hardest question he'd received in years. It never made much sense, he said. What would I even do? AT&T stores are everywhere? I joked. I'm being serious, you dick, he said, then ruffled my hair while tickling my side. Okay, I laughed, elbowing him to stop. So when's the official confession? We'll see, he answered, and I didn't know how much I factored into his whether I wanted to be a part of it or not. The following week Dad seemed on the verge of snapping. He yelled at me for using blue paper towels to clean the windows, and not old newspapers. He even threatened to send his guys home, indefinitely, and without pay, after Young had teased that he wasn't being a good boss by ordering everyone lunch. You are lucky I am standing to see your face. Dad yelled at Young, who laughed in response until he realized Dad wasn't joking. In the afternoon, a new customer finally appeared, the first one we had since the beginning of the week. She was elderly and white, dressed in a white grandma cardigan. Dad was so excited that he opened a new box of pens, so she could write her contact information on the invoice with ease. He promised that the owner and the main smog technician would be handling her repairs, trying his best to speak with zero trace of his slight accent. I thought the customer was about to die. Right there in the waiting room, she spoke that languidly, and this, combined with Dad straining to avoid stressing the last syllable of his words like the older Cambos usually do, lent the entire interaction a slow-motion quality. Apparently, I realized, Dad could no longer trust his guys to do even the simplest of tasks. He did the customer's preliminary diagnostic himself, which wasn't actually necessary, as all the car needed was an oil change. In the waiting room, the customer asked if the supermarket across the street was open, and I told her, yes, ma'am, even though I'd never called anyone that in my life. As she left to go shopping, I considered whether I should say that the supermarket carried mostly expired canned foods, but I didn't want to disrupt the shaky equilibrium of her patronage. Young came into the waiting room shortly after the customer left. He was holding a small stack of papers. You know how to read songs still? He asked. Let me see, I said, remembering how as a teenager I'd labeled all the notes of Young's sheet music, even going so far as to writing down which finger should play what key on the piano. He would hover over my shoulder as I transcribed rock classics from the 80s, from when everyone first immigrated. The sheet music he handed me now was for the song Every Breath You Take. It's good you are here for your dad, he said, rubbing the top of my head. Because you can do this for me. Yeah, I said. What's this for anyway? When the monks come, I will ask them if my band can play at Cambodian New Year. The monks love Sting. Wait, the monks are coming. You do not know? They come tomorrow. That's bad, right? I said, and glanced to my left, through the open door to the garage. Just then, Dad was ducking his head under the hood of the customer's car. I could only catch his butt sticking up in the air. Monks coming, that happens when you fail. Young sighed. They come when you first open business, to bless everything, but after that, they are not supposed to come. No, we are not supposed to need them. Hey. Please keep on doing the music, okay? My band is my plan B. I cannot be the assistant manager my whole life. It is too stressful. Oh. Right, I said, staring at the endless bars of melody. That makes sense. Dad had finished working on the customer's car by the time she returned with a plastic bag full of canned garbanzo beans. He completed her invoice with a painstaking attention to detail, marking down the $29.99 charge and taking careful notes of all the labor he had done. Then, as the customer paid and took back her keys, as satisfied with our services as one could be, really, I suddenly heard the voice Dr. Hang's wife in my head. It was that lecture she delivered in my Honda, the one about marrying a Cambodian girl who wanted a green card. How many oil changes, I found myself wondering, would add up to $50,000? And just how long would it take to get there? At home that night, Mom was prepping egg rolls in the kitchen while Dad napped on the couch, the TV blaring out a football game. I asked Mom if I could help, and she responded, "So today you have time for me?" She scooped minced meat out of a bowl and onto a wrapper. How lucky of me. My own son will not abandon me like he does every other night. This for the monks tomorrow? I asked, and she rolled her eyes. If anyone ever listened to me, we wouldn't need this. You think I have time to cook 100 named chien on a workday? What can I do? Want me to help wrap? No, you're too clumsy. She shook her head. Go mix the fish sauce for dipping. How do I do that? I asked. I forgot. Mom threw her hands, both covered in raw meat, over her head, pretended to mess up her hair out of frustration. She wanted me to know how dumb I was, for my failure to remember her recipes, and honestly I agreed with her. Then she walked over to the cabinets and pulled out an empty plastic cylinder, one of those cheap containers that restaurants provide for leftovers. Along the side, she had stuck 3 pieces of blue painter's tape, all spaced out unevenly. She pointed at each, saying, warm water to here, fish sauce to here, vinegar to here. Sugar and roasted peanuts to taste. What happens when we lose this container? I joked, taking it from her hands. How will we make dipping sauce without you? You better not lose my stuff when I die, she replied, and scooped more meat. So when are we meeting him? Meeting who? I answered. The boy you're seeing, she said. Where did you hear that from? I asked as I heated the water. Don't tell me you go out every night and aren't with a boy. Don't lie to me. I'm your mother. She raised the new egg roll to our eye level. Here, you see? She said. This is perfect. And it was. Avoiding her question about Paul, I finished mixing the ingredients, and then held the takeout container now filled with clear bronze liquid. I felt its weight shift from my left hand to my right. Of course, based off Mom's method, it was easy to record the exact ratios that her dipping sauce required. Yet at that moment, for whatever reason, the future appeared so precarious, the way a tradition like this could depend on a flimsy plastic. I'm not seeing anyone, really, I'm not, I finally told Mom, still thinking about our culture, how Cambos like us retained our Camboness mostly through our food. Egg rolls stirring up portals back to the homeland, but just in your mouth, until they disintegrated into saliva and vanished down your throat. Mom looked at me, skeptically, and rolled another egg roll. After Mom and I had cleaned the kitchen, I sat on my bed and texted Paul that I didn't feel well, but that we'd definitely hook up the next day. I put my phone away and fell asleep. The following morning, I could smell Mom deep-frying egg rolls in the backyard before heading off to work. I read the texts Paul had sent the previous night. Oh, ain't a thing but some blue balls. Then, I think tonight's the night it happens. Gonna tell Meryl. Then, nothing. I thought of responding, how'd it go, feeling more excited than I cared to admit, if also unsettled, as though a simple text might cement something into our relationship I wasn't ready for yet. I ended up sending nothing. Later that morning at the shop, hours before the divine assault was scheduled, Dad and I mopped up the residual grease from the garage floor, shined the Buddhas in the waiting room to have a pristine glimmering, and took down the many posters of naked Thai women. We set up a folded table, placed a clean sheet over it, and arranged Mom's egg rolls next to the other dishes, all prepared by the wives of Dad's guys: lemongrass beef sticks, glass noodles stir-fried with bean curd and ground pork, red-hot papaya salad drenched in fish sauce, and also, of course, the requisite and huge pot of steaming white rice. The entire time Dad had looked especially grave, as if the communists were pulling off another coup d'état. I wanted to cheer him up, to assert that no one thought any less of him, but I couldn't think of anything to say. Around noon, 5 monks came marching behind Dr. Heng's wife, all of them sporting the same burnt orange robes and sandy beige crocs, armed with packets and packets of incense. Dad and I bowed to each monk in a row, our hands clasped together. Then the monks walked around the shop, examining the corners and crevices, sprinkling blessed water over the grease-stained walls. When they finished the inspection, the monks lit their incense in every room, even the storage room, with those cases of flammable Mobile 5W30 oil. The aroma of burning flowers, I guessed, was supposed to create a force field that would thwart evil spirits while attracting customers. After the shop had been suffused with a light haze, Dr. Heng's wife spread a few woven mats over the garage floor, then aggressively gestured at Dad, his guys, and me. "Get down!" She shouted through her teeth, as if 10 minutes had already passed since her gesturing. "You cannot put yourselves in a position above the monks. They need to sit. What are you doing just standing around?" We fell to our knees, and the monks followed, sitting down in the center of the mats. They proceeded to chant in low, hushed voices, ones I'd heard since I was a kid, but had never bothered to understand. We watched them pray, our hands clasped together again. 15 minutes of non-stop droning passed, and maybe I experienced this simply from my numbing thighs and butt cheeks, but the smoke from the incense felt asphyxiating, jammed into my pores and blasted into my nostrils, like it was clogging the very space between my cells. A headache cleaved through my brain, and I remembered the first time Dad had been serious with me about the genocide. I was 10 years old, barely into the double digits, and it was Cambodian New Year. Some older kids had fixated on my shoes or something. Behind the Wat and next to the field, where the pop-up stalls were releasing clouds of barbecuing smoke, they pushed me against the rusty chain-link fence. They interrogated me about whether I had communists for relatives. "Your gong probably killed people, you faggot," their leader said. "Probably sucked Pol Pot's dick." I didn't fully understand his taunting, but I was still upset, and when I ran back to Dad, sobbing and heaving, he denied any communist connections to our bloodline, but confirmed our history, how half of everyone's relatives had died. "It was a thing that was done to us, that's all," he said, wiping my tears away. "You better get all this crying out now," he also said. "No use in crying when it already happened." Then he lifted me onto his shoulders, even though I'd grown too big for that, before walking us both inside the Wat. A crowd had gathered in front of the monks. We joined them and prayed, for good karma and luck and blessings, for the upcoming year, and our future reincarnated lives, and I slipped into a total hopelessness. What had we done to deserve such violence? How terrible it must have been, our country and culture's past karma. These concerns came rushing back to me as I kneeled on the shop's oily floor, on the same style of woven mats from that fateful Cambodian New Year. I felt a gloom only deepened by the thrumming of unintelligible chanting. I couldn't bear watching Dad resort to these half-broken beliefs. So I thought about Paul. He was a decent guy with a decent job, someone I liked enough to bring into my real, established life, the one I hadn't even started to build. And he would become even more decent, if he had come out, and stopped lying to his girlfriend. I could take a chance on Paul, I thought. I could settle down and commit to working with Dad. I could be the second dutiful and mature son my parents would rely on for support. I didn't know what I had to offer, really, other than cleaning as the shop's janitor and transcribing music for Om Young. Even so, the prospect of my moving away, for yet another time, struck me as incredibly selfish. Bah, I whispered, and he either didn't hear or was ignoring me. Regardless, I kept muttering, bah. 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 You need to be focusing, Dad answered, though I had no clear idea of what I needed to focus on. Bah, don't worry, I continued, my legs shaking from the numbness. I'm gonna help you. I don't know how, but I'm gonna help the shop. Dad said gruffly, can you just be worrying about yourself? He sighed and angled his face at me. The shop is providing for you, that's why we have the shop. And it hit me once more, that look of grief. But this time no one spared me its full force. The past year flashed across my eyes. The days I'd spent at the shop doing nothing, my inability to apply for legitimate jobs. What had everyone thought of me, I wondered, of Dad? His son jobless, a college degree going to waste. I began to realize the extent I had been a complete child, one that was chaining my father down to a failing business. Dad's attention returned to the monks all trying to fix the shop, and I couldn't breathe. I couldn't believe myself. Then Paul came to my thoughts again, how we were supposed to hang out that night. What I just envisioned, committing to a life here, it appeared so stupid, even as the sentiment retained a sort of comfort. I took my phone out of my pocket, secretly checking my notifications as it lay on the ground. Several texts from Paul were popping up, but before I could open any of them, the monks stopped chanting and everyone stopped praying. Dr. Heng's wife placed empty bowls in front of the monks, and then handed the rest of us, the representatives of the shop, our own bowls she had filled with warm rice. Still crouched on our knees, we formed a line. We shuffled in a procession, crawling on the mats, scooping rice into the bowls of each of the monks. When the ritual was done, the monks started eating their feast, and I stood next to the waiting room's door, one hand stuffed into my pocket, the other gripping my phone. With my motivation to read my texts waning, I took in the garage of the shop. It felt smaller now. Machines that had once seemed gigantic only reached my shoulders. Listening from outside the waiting room, I heard Dr. Heng's wife talking to Dad, so I peeked through the doorway. Bong, you need to make a donation, she was saying at the counter. Write the check before the monks get full. Do it quickly, Bong. Okay, Dad said, as though chanting his own kind of prayer, and as he wrote out the check, I found myself trying to understand the creases of his disgruntled, defeated brow. They were spelling something out for me, some dispatch sent from across the universe by the accumulation of our reincarnated lives from every different past we'd ever experienced. If this day is harnessing as much karma as possible, his wrinkles red, more spiritual power than this community has ever seen, maybe the shop will have good business. And when that happens, hopefully, fingers crossed, we will soon break even from the cost of our donation. As I stood between the waiting room and the garage, I watched Dad finish signing the check. Watched him hand that flimsy paper to Dr. Heng's wife, who stuffed it into her giant purse. All that money, probably a whole month's earnings, was now swimming among loose pocket change, and I stopped caring about those texts from Paul, the smallness of the shop, the monks stuffing their mouths with Mom's egg rolls. Nothing behind me seemed to matter. Everything receded into the smoky blur of the incense, the shadows of all those Buddhas. I wished for only one thing: to send a response to Dad's message, etched onto my own forehead, a beacon-eyed shootout into the ether. But what, I was ready to ask, for every life Dad and I had lived and lost, will we do after?